We are two hunters, and we killed Bigfoot in the Alaskan wilderness. And we have the evidence to prove exactly what has happened. But what is even more bizarre is what happened after we killed him. Because what came after us on that day is something so extraordinary. It's the darkest thing anyone has ever witnessed in Alaska.
I'm Nico Arden, and I went into the Alaskan wilderness with my friend Rafe Kellen for a remote hunting trip we had been planning for months. We had hunted together before, so I trusted Rafe and knew how he handled himself outdoors. At that point, neither of us had any reason to think this trip would be different from the others. We flew into a remote part of Alaska with enough gear to stay out for several days. Between us, we had our rifles, binoculars, offline maps, and a compact pack raft for the river. The plan was simple: hunt, move camp when we needed to, and stay well away from the few marked routes in the area. By the second morning, though, something had crossed directly through our route, and the tracks it left behind made us stop. The tracks were too large for any person, but they did not look like bear prints either. They crossed the mud beside a narrow creek, then disappeared into brush where several branches had been snapped well above my head. Rafe and I followed them for a short distance before deciding it was smarter to keep moving toward our original route. Less than an hour later, we found the same kind of tracks again. This time, they crossed directly in front of us, and whatever made them was much closer than before. We slowed down after that and kept our rifles ready as we moved through the brush. The tracks stayed close to the creek, but every few minutes we heard something much heavier moving through the trees beside us. It never stayed in one place long enough for us to get a clear look. Then the sound stopped completely. Rafe had just turned toward me when a huge figure came through the brush ahead, moving fast enough that neither of us had time to think. We both fired. I saw Bigfoot jerk as the shots hit. It stumbled sideways, crashed through a line of smaller trees, and disappeared over the edge of a steep slope. We heard branches snapping all the way down, followed by one heavy impact at the bottom. For several seconds, neither of us moved. We had both seen the same thing, and there was blood on the brush where Bigfoot had gone over the edge. Whatever we had just shot had not simply run away. We started down the slope carefully, following the broken branches and fresh blood through the rocks. If Bigfoot was lying dead at the bottom, we knew we would need proof. At the bottom of the slope, we found Bigfoot lying partly against a fallen tree. The ground around the body was torn up from the fall, and fresh blood covered the leaves beneath its side. Rafe stayed a few steps back while I moved closer and checked for any sign of movement. There was none. Up close, it was even bigger than it had looked through the brush. One of the gunshot wounds was high along the upper body, and another had opened lower along the side. Blood was still fresh around both wounds, and there were broken branches above us that matched the path it had taken down the slope. I also noticed several older marks around one of its ankles, but with everything else we were looking at, I barely gave them any thought.
For me, there was no question what we were looking at. This was the same Bigfoot we had just shot. That was when the excitement started giving away a completely different problem.
We were standing over something people had argued about for decades, and if we walked out of Alaska with nothing more than our word, most people would say we had made the whole thing up. Rafe pulled out his phone and started taking pictures while I stayed beside the body, already thinking about what we could bring back that nobody could dismiss. We spent the next several minutes documenting everything we could. Rafe took wide shots of the body where it had fallen, then moved closer for the face, hands, feet, and the wounds along its side. I placed my rifle beside one arm for scale and measured the length of 1 foot against the tape we carried in our kit. We photographed the blood on the ground, the broken branches above us, and the trail down the slope, so there would be a record of exactly where the body had come from. The more we recorded, the more obvious one problem became. There was no practical way to carry the whole body out. Even between the two of us, it was far too heavy, and dragging it through miles of rough country would have taken longer than either of us could manage safely. We marked the location on the offline map and checked our position twice so we could find the slope again if we returned with help. We still needed something we could physically carry out, which made taking part of the body start to seem reasonable.
We decided to take the hand because it was the one part we could realistically carry without slowing ourselves down too much. Even then, neither of us liked the idea of cutting into the body. We had gone out there to hunt, not to end up standing over something like this trying to decide which piece would convince people we were telling the truth.
Once the hand was free, we wrapped it in several layers from our kit and sealed it inside a separate bag before putting it deep inside his pack. We also collected a small amount of hair and blood from around the wounds, then photographed the body again after we were done, so there would be a record of exactly what we had taken. Before leaving, we took one last video showing the slope, the broken trail through the brush, and the body where it had fallen. At that point, we thought we had done everything right. We had the photos, the video, the samples, and the hand. We had only gone a short distance from the slope when I noticed fresh blood on a patch of leaves beside the trail. At first, I assumed it had come from the body, but the drops continued away from the slope in a completely different direction. A few yards farther on, there was another smear across a rock, then another on a broken branch. Rafe and I stopped and looked back toward where we had left the body. Whatever had made this trail had been moving through the drainage while bleeding heavily, and there was no way the blood could have come from the Bigfoot lying behind us. There had apparently been another one nearby when we fired. We followed the trail through a narrow section of timber where the blood became easier to track. There were fresh impressions in the mud, broken brush, and several places where something large had pushed straight through instead of going around. In a few places, one side of the trail was disturbed more heavily than the other, almost like whatever made it had been favoring one leg. We still had no idea what had injured it, or whether it even knew we were there. Then branches started breaking somewhere off to our left, followed by another sound behind us. The movement stayed just beyond the trees, close enough that we could hear it, but never long enough to see what was making it. Then Bigfoot stepped out behind us. Another appeared farther along the slope. Within seconds, more shapes started moving through the timber on both sides of the drainage. Rafe and I backed away together with our rifles ready, trying to keep enough open ground between us and the trees. None of them rushed us immediately, but every time we moved, they changed position with us. By the time we reached the edge of the timber, I had counted 5 adult Bigfoots. What bothered me was how spread out they were. One stayed behind us, 2 kept pace through the trees on our right, and the others moved farther ahead as if they were already cutting off the easiest routes through the drainage. It did not feel like 5 animals reacting independently.
For a moment, I wondered whether taking part of the dead Bigfoot had caused this, but there was no way to know.
What mattered more was that 5 of them were now moving with us, and the open gravel ahead was the only place where we would have enough room to see them coming. We moved quickly toward the gravel bar while the Bigfoot stayed inside the tree line. The moment we reached open ground, I pulled out a bear banger and fired it toward the closest one. The blast cracked through the drainage and sent it back several yards, but the reaction only lasted a few seconds. The others spread farther apart instead of retreating. One moved upstream, while another crossed behind a stand of trees ahead of us, forcing Rafe and me to angle farther toward the creek. I realized they were not simply following us. They were affecting where we could go. We kept moving across the gravel while I watched the tree line, and Rafe checked the route ahead. Every time we tried to turn toward thicker cover, one of the Bigfoots appeared near that side first. When we pushed toward the creek instead, 2 of them began moving along the opposite bank. The bear banger had given us distance, but it had not scared them away. By then, the fresh blood trail we had been following was almost forgotten. Our immediate problem was finding a way through the drainage without letting 5 Bigfoots close around us again. Then, Rafe noticed another smear of blood on the rocks ahead. We picked up the blood trail again along the edge of the gravel. A few yards farther on, I noticed that one of the outer wrappings in Rafe's pack had picked up blood from the hand we had taken.
I pulled it free and left it on a flat rock behind us. If the Bigfoots were following the smell of the body, I wanted to know before we went any farther.
We moved another 50 yards and stopped where the gravel narrowed. One of the Bigfoots came out of the trees and approached the wrapping. It picked it up, smelled it for only a few seconds, and dropped it. Then it continued in our direction. That answered at least one question. Whatever was keeping them around us was not just the piece of the body we were carrying. A harsh call came from somewhere farther up the drainage, and two of the other Bigfoots immediately shifted toward it. For the first time, their attention seemed divided between us and something ahead. Rafe pointed toward the blood trail. It continued in the same direction. We followed it around a line of rocks and found something stretched across the narrow passage that neither of us had noticed before. A heavy steel cable had been hidden beneath the brush. The cable was thicker than anything I would have expected to find that far out, and it had been positioned low enough that something moving through the gap at speed could easily catch a leg. One end disappeared beneath a pile of rocks, while the other ran toward a steel anchor wedged into the ground. There was dark hair caught against the metal and fresh blood on the stones beside it. Rafe crouched near the edge of the setup, while I kept watching the timber behind us. The blood trail we had been following led straight through the narrow passage, then continued on the other side. Whatever had been bleeding had crossed this trap recently. A few feet farther on, we found deep scrape marks cut into the rock and more hair wrapped around the cable. It looked like something large had been caught there and fought hard enough to drag the line sideways before getting free. Then a branch cracked behind us. I turned and saw movement between the trees higher up the drainage. One of the 5 Bigfoots was coming toward us fast. We did not have time to study the trap anymore. Rafe grabbed the loose section of cable while I backed toward the narrow opening, and suddenly the thing someone else had built to catch Bigfoot was the only thing between us and the one coming straight at us. Rafe pulled the loose cable farther across the narrow gap while I kept my rifle trained on the trees behind us. The setup was already under tension, so we did not need to rebuild anything. We only had to move the line into the path Bigfoot was taking and hope it held long enough to slow it down. The movement came closer fast. Branches snapped, rocks shifted, and then Bigfoot burst through the brush almost exactly where we expected. Its leg hit the cable, the catch tightened, and the force of it pulled Bigfoot sideways into the rocks. For a second, neither of us moved, but then Bigfoot started tearing at the line. The cable stretched tight across the gap while the anchor ground against the stone. Rafe and I backed away instead of getting closer, knowing we had only bought ourselves a few seconds. Bigfoot pulled once, then again, harder each time. The steel held, but the rocks around the anchor started shifting. We turned and moved farther up the drainage just as the cable snapped loose behind us. By the time I looked back, Bigfoot was already getting to its feet.
The river was still our best option, but getting there meant crossing several miles of uneven ground with at least one Bigfoot somewhere behind us.
According to the map, the drainage curved south before opening toward a wider channel, and if we could reach that water, the packraft would give us a faster way out than staying on foot. We redistributed the gear before moving again. I kept the bear bangers where I could reach them quickly, while Rafe checked the pack and made sure nothing had been damaged during the scramble around the trap. Then we started across the ridge, staying above the thicker timber whenever the terrain allowed it. From up there, we could see more of the drainage below us, and that was when I noticed another cable setup near a narrow path leading toward the river. This one was positioned differently from the first. Instead of crossing an animal trail, it ran beside a route that looked like people had been using it regularly. We stopped just long enough to study the anchor and the direction of the line, because by then it was becoming obvious that the traps below us were part of something much larger than one isolated setup. We stayed low along the ridge and followed the route toward the river until Rafe spotted movement below us near a stand of spruce. 3 men were working around the cable setups, but what caught my attention was how calmly they moved through an area where 5 Bigfoots had been following us. One carried a rifle, another was checking the lines, and the third opened a plastic container beside a cleared patch near the tree line. Farther downhill, I could also see a worn route leading toward the river, wide enough that equipment had been moved through it more than once. A few minutes later, Bigfoot walked out of the woods and went straight toward him. The man did not raise his rifle or back away. He scattered food across the ground, and Bigfoot stopped where he wanted it to. When the man moved toward another cleared spot, Bigfoot followed at a distance like it already knew the routine. Rafe started taking pictures while I watched through the binoculars. We had spent the last hour trying to stay ahead of creatures. These men seemed completely comfortable standing beside. The traps, feeding areas, and cleared paths suddenly looked less like separate pieces and more like one system. As I kept watching, I noticed something on the Bigfoot standing nearest the feeding area. There was an old band of scar tissue around one ankle, almost exactly where one of those cable traps would tighten. That made me think back to the body at the bottom of the slope. I had noticed older marks around one of its legs while we were taking pictures, but at the time I had not thought much about them.
Now, I was looking at another Bigfoot carrying the same kind of injury while calmly standing beside the men who maintained those traps. For the first time, I started wondering whether the one we killed had been part of the same group.
Then one of the men stopped and looked up toward the ridge. He stayed there, scanning the slope long enough that I knew we had been seen. We moved back from the ridge before the man below could get a better look at us, but the reaction from the clearing was immediate. One of the other men stopped what he was doing and looked uphill, while the third moved toward the path leading around the base of the slope. Rafe put his phone away, and we started cutting across the ridge toward the river, keeping the trees between us and the men below. Before we had gone far, another Bigfoot came out near one of the feeding spots, and the men barely reacted. One of them raised an arm and made a short motion toward the river path, and Bigfoot changed direction and followed it. A second one appeared farther down and did the same. That was enough for me to understand how much control these men thought they had. They were not just feeding the Bigfoots. They were using the same routes, gestures, and routines to move them through the area. Then, the man who had been watching the ridge started climbing toward us with his rifle, while another moved downhill to cut off the path to the river. We were no longer watching from a distance. They were coming to find us. We moved faster along the ridge, but the men below were matching us. One kept climbing toward our position, while another disappeared through the trees ahead, trying to reach the river path before we did. Rafe had just pulled his phone back out to check the route when loose rock gave way under his boot and he went down hard on one knee. His pack swung around and the top flap came open. The man climbing toward us was close enough by then to see what spilled partly into view: the wrapped hand, one of the sample bags, and the blood-stained material packed around them. His whole reaction changed. He stopped for a second, stared at the pack, then started shouting toward the others below while pointing straight at us. Rafe shoved everything back inside and tightened the straps as we moved again. But the men were no longer just trying to find out who we were. One of them came uphill much faster, and another started cutting across the slope with his rifle ready. Their reaction made it obvious the dead Bigfoot meant something to them, and seeing that hand had made the situation much worse. From that point on, they were not going to let us simply walk away with it. As we crossed a more open section of the ridge, I looked back and saw one of the men stop following us. Instead of continuing uphill, he turned and moved quickly back through the drainage in the direction we had come from.
I could not know where he was going, but the dead Bigfoot was back that way. Even if Rafe and I escaped and returned with help, there was now a real chance the body would be gone.
We cut across the slope toward the cable route we had studied earlier, with the men closing from two directions. Rafe stayed slightly ahead while I watched the trees below us. One of the trappers was moving fast enough that he nearly reached the narrow path before we did, so we stopped trying to outrun him and used the terrain instead. The cable setup was already under tension. Rafe shifted the loose line across the approach, while I moved farther uphill and made enough noise to draw the man straight toward us. He came through the brush with his rifle up, saw me, and rushed the last few steps without noticing the line at his feet. The catch snapped tight around his lower leg and dropped him hard against the rocks. His rifle slid away, and for a second the path opened. We started downhill immediately, but the route we had planned to use was blocked by another cable line stretched across the narrow passage. One of the other men was already coming up from below, and behind us, the trapped man was trying to free himself. We had bought ourselves a few seconds, but the river was now the only way out. We left the blocked path and cut straight downhill through thicker brush, aiming for the river before the other men could get around us. The slope was steep enough that we were half running and half sliding between the trees, with branches catching our clothes and loose rock shifting under our boots. Behind us, one of the trappers was shouting, while another answered from farther below. When we finally reached the river, we pulled out the pack raft and inflated it as fast as we could. Rafe strapped his pack beneath the front cargo cords so it would stay out of the water, with the wrapped hand and samples still sealed inside. We kept the phone in a small, dry pouch, clipped near the side of the raft where we could reach it for the map and anything else we needed to record. Before we launched, I checked the route one last time and tried to memorize the direction of the river and the major bends ahead. The moment the raft was ready, we pushed into the current and paddled hard toward the center of the channel. We finally had real distance between ourselves and the man on shore.
I thought the river might give us the advantage we needed until we heard the motor behind us and saw a boat coming around the bends upstream.
The motorboat came around the bend fast enough that I knew the trappers had already been moving toward the river before we launched. One of the men was at the controls, but he was not alone. Two adult Bigfoots were standing in the boat with him, one near the bow and another behind the driver. Neither was tied down or restrained, yet both stayed exactly where they were as the boat closed the distance. Along the bank, I could see movement through the trees where the other men and Bigfoots were keeping pace with us. The whole river corridor suddenly felt like part of the same system we had seen from the ridge. Rafe and I paddled harder, trying to keep the pack raft in the strongest current, but the motorboat was gaining on us. The driver kept angling toward our side of the channel, forcing us closer to the opposite bank where the other Bigfoots were moving through the trees. Every route we tried to take was being narrowed for us. We had already seen those men use food and repeated paths to move the Bigfoots where they wanted them. Now they were using that control to make sure we did not get out with what we had taken. The boat closed the distance while the other three Bigfoots moved along the bank with the remaining men. Every time we tried to angle toward one side of the river, someone was already there waiting for us. The trapper at the controls pushed closer until the wake started rocking the pack raft, and one of the Bigfoots near the bow leaned forward as if it was watching exactly where we were going. We tried to stay in the faster current, but they kept forcing us toward shallower water near the bank. One of the men on shore moved ahead of us and made the same short arm motion we had seen near the feeding sites. One of the Bigfoots beside him immediately broke away from the trees and headed straight toward the water. Then second one followed a few seconds later.
They were not just chasing us along the bank anymore. They were being sent into the river. Rafe tightened the straps, holding his pack to the front of the raft, while I paddled harder. But the first Bigfoot was already swimming toward us and closing the distance.
The first Bigfoot entered the river from the bank and came straight toward us, using long strokes that carried it through the current with almost no trouble. A second one followed farther downstream, while the boat stayed behind us and kept pushing us away from the deeper channel. Rafe leaned forward and pulled harder on the straps, holding his pack to the front of the raft while I tried to keep us moving. The first Bigfoot reached the side of the pack raft and grabbed at the cargo cords. The raft jerked hard enough to throw both of us off balance, and water came over the side as I hit at its arm with the paddle. It let go for a second, then came back and caught the front of the raft again. Rafe tried to pull the pack toward him, but the Bigfoot had already grabbed one of the straps. The two of them pulled against each other while the raft twisted sideways in the current. One of Bigfoot's hands raked across Rafe's shoulder as he reached forward, tearing through his jacket and leaving several deep scratches underneath. He yelled and pulled back, and that was enough for the Bigfoot to rip the pack free. The pack hit the water beside us and stayed on the surface for a few seconds. I could still see it close enough that my first instinct was to turn the raft and grab it. Everything we had taken from the body was inside, including the hand. And after everything we had already gone through, watching it float away felt impossible. I started pulling the paddle around, but the Bigfoot was still beside the pack and the second one was already closing from downstream. Rafe was bleeding badly and the boat was still behind us. Going back for it would have put us directly between all of them. I kept the raft pointed downstream instead. A few seconds later, the Bigfoot reached the pack and pulled it toward the bank until it disappeared from sight with a wrapped hand and every sample we had collected. The second Bigfoot kept coming after the raft, while Rafe bled through his torn jacket. I could see him trying to keep pressure on his shoulder with one hand while using the other to steady himself. The trapper in the boat moved closer again, keeping us pinned toward the shallower side of the river.
I reached for the dry pouch clipped beside me because the phone was the only evidence we had left. But before I could secure it, the second Bigfoot hit the raft from the side.
The impact rolled us hard enough that the pouch tore free from its clip and dropped into the water. I grabbed for it once and missed. It floated beside us for only a few seconds before the current pulled it under the wake from the boat. By the time the raft straightened again, the phone was gone too. Every photograph and video we had taken had disappeared with it, and those men were still coming. With the evidence gone, all we could do was stay alive long enough to get out. The river narrowed ahead, and the water started breaking harder over exposed rock, which made it more difficult for the motorboat to stay directly behind us. I kept the raft pointed toward the roughest part of the channel, while Rafe held pressure against his shoulder and tried to help whenever he could. One of the Bigfoots was still swimming along the edge of the current, but the rocks forced it toward the bank and created enough distance for us to pull ahead. The boat followed for another stretch, then slowed as the channel split around a line of shallow stones. We took the narrower side without knowing where it would lead because it was the only route the larger boat could not follow safely. The pack raft scraped hard against one rock and started losing air almost immediately, but by then the bend behind us had disappeared. We stayed with the current until the raft became too soft to trust, then dragged it onto a gravel bank and started climbing toward higher ground. Rafe was bleeding and most of our gear was gone, but nobody was directly behind us anymore. We left the damaged raft on the gravel and started moving on foot, following the route we had studied earlier and keeping above the thick timber. Rafe could still move, but the scratches across his shoulder were deep enough that we had to stop twice so I could clean them and tighten the bandage. Every time we stopped, I checked the ridge behind us for movement. Nothing appeared, but neither of us trusted the silence. We had already seen how quickly the trappers could move through that country and how easily the Bigfoots followed the routes they were given. The final stretch took much longer than it should have because we were tired, soaked, and carrying only what had stayed with us through the river. By the time we reached the extraction point, the light was already fading and Rafe's shoulder was still bleeding beneath the bandage, but we had finally made it out. Everything we thought would prove what happened was gone. All Rafe and I had left were the injuries, the damaged gear, and what we remembered from that day. I know that is not enough to prove anything to anyone else. We lost the proof, but we never lost the truth of what happened out there.
Followed for another stretch, then slowed as the channel split around a line of shallow stones. Then slowed as the channel split around a line of shallow stones.